And I think the touched on CIB existing. This work really complements the indicators that CIB uses rather than the subjective, so mental health, self-rated health. They're not primarily spatial, and that's the space that we're moving into now. So it works really nicely, I think, hand in hand. We've actually been discussing the whole CIB and Aura and how they can marry up better. So that has come up, but I think they're complementary.
Can I ask a question, Chris? I get the Aura and access to data. When you're creating indexes, it's really important to understand where that came from, the limitations to that data, so that you're not potentially getting researchers slicing and dicing and performing analysis that might not be true to the actual raw data they're using. So are there flags?
There are flags, and it's actually quite a contentious issue, both within the Aura and the research community, and the data providers too, because you create a data product, and people can question that methodology. So do we actually disable, say, performing particular operations with interval data, ordinal data, or ratio data, or do we allow people to do regressions on everything? And I suppose we do have mechanisms to try and monitor and look at, putting some flags or not, or disabling joining of particular variables. But at the end of the day, then we're standing in a role of controlling how the data is used, and
but maybe not controlling it, but informing the user. Hey, you're using this raw data that was collected at this period of time, you're trying to slice and dice with this raw data at this period of time. It might not match because it was based off one ABS geography. We've moved forward 5 or 6 years, it's a new geography. It may not be just constraining it, but just flagging it to the user. Maybe this might not make sense at the end.
But that's one issue. The other one is the degree to which, if you do it, trying to create indicators and so on using different variables that might come at different points in time from different data collections, that's a problem too. But you can sort of try and overcome that in some ways. I'll give just one other example. Where you're using spatial data, aggregated spatial data in the frameworks of the census geography or whatever, typically people do not use, if they're going to undertake regression and other sorts of analysis, they don't use the now widely available routines to do the adjustments to address things like the spatial autocorrelation problem. And we've actually got a suite of spatial econometric models that will be available on the portal, open source, which do these adjustments automatically across the census geography. Now, if you run a regression analysis on, say, SLA data, and you don't do those adjustments, you will get totally different results than if you do, and taking into account the spatial autocorrelation problems, things like that. So,
isn't this tool going to be used by researchers that perhaps don't have the spatial literacy that we do?
Well, you try to give them some guidance there, but in the end, you have well-informed and less well-informed users too. But I guess I'll make a general point. I don't think you can ever control for what is variability in terms of methodological levels of ignorance or knowledge. It's difficult to do so. You can provide guidance. It's very difficult.
There's a number of hands going up around the place, so obviously this is a topic of some interest. So if you're happy, we'll keep it going for a little bit. I'll go black dress, grey suit, pink shirt.
Thank you. Can I suggest that there are two elements maybe to that debate? So statistical capability, obviously knowing when to use particular types of data, but the other one is about having the associated metadata available so that you can actually make quality-informed decisions on a particular data set and its fitness for purpose.
Yeah.
I suspect that maybe the point that Mohsen and Graysuit was going to.
Well, I see perhaps two aspects to it. One is making the data available and providing the right metadata to support for the use. But the other aspect is also the user requirement. So in particular, in our case, working on the housing affordability, there are really different views on how you can measure affordability and how you can do analysis. And you can come from different backgrounds, economic backgrounds, urban planning background. So there are different, perhaps, user requirements for each sort of analysis. So it's not only the data preparation and providing the metadata, and this is also important to get the user's requirement exactly and precisely in developing any tool.
Yeah. I also saw Stephanie's hand at one point.
Yeah.
No, I'll go to Christine first.
Oh, well, sorry, I was thinking through what's the difference between ORAN and CIB, and thinking through the spatial issue. And for a lot of what we get as spatial, it is an output mechanism for knowledge. It is not an understanding of the relationship of spatial dynamic and human dynamic. And I think what ORAN offers is the potential to get a better understanding of just how much the spatial dynamic contributes to the ultimate behaviours. So even in something like walkability, I think we're probably still measuring the spatial potential rather than the spatial uptake, the human uptake. But I think ORAN, with its collaborative sharing approach, will enable us to tease that out better. And I think if researchers can understand what we're really talking about in spatial, then it might help avoid pitfalls along the way.
Very nice. Thank you.
Can I suggest that one of the best ways of actually avoiding some of these difficulties is to put it in the public domain? Yeah. The more that your stuff is not hidden, I'm coming from somebody who's outside the research community, but obviously sees the value in this. Again, if we've got access to that, we can sometimes challenge and sort of see, you've actually used that, we didn't collect it in that data, because quite a lot of the data is going to come out of sort of things like local government. We can actually sort of, we're very good at criticising. And if things are in the public domain, we'll tell you. And that, I think that's probably one of your best protections.
Yeah.
Don't hide stuff. If we don't have to hide it, don't lock it up.
Yep. Right. Well, we seem to be moving into a stage of greater freedom of access to data, thanks to some state-level decisions. In any case, yeah.
Just while we're talking about this idea of data, something that you brought up in your talk was this idea of privileging data as a research agenda, data collection as a research agenda. And then in the same breath, you turned around and said, and we have funding until the end of the year, and then we're going to disappear. And I sort of thought to myself, yeah, that sounds about right. And I was reflecting also that I'm an owner of a considerable database, which my colleagues who are international are wondering what we should do with. And one of the things we were talking about was the possibility of putting in place grants to mine data. And one of the things that every senior researcher in that environment, which was the European environment, said to us was, you cannot get funding to mine data. Now, it seems to me that if you want to have mines of data that are supported long-term, we need to do something about privileging research or finding a way to fund research which uses the data, because otherwise there's no point in having these reserves of data. So if you have a situation where you can't get funding to do research on data that already exists, then there's no point in having reserves of data.
That's not true. You can get funding for certain data analysis. I know lots of ARC grants.
Well, I think Australia might be different in that respect then, because
I don't know about that.
That's certainly the feedback
There's
we
a lot
got
of
in the European
data
Union.
analysis that's based on, on published work and so on. I know in Europe, grants in the regional science areas where people have got funding to do metadata analysis.
Okay. Probably doesn't not that critical this afternoon, Austin.
Comment on the point that was made, a question about the difference between CIV, as in Community Indicators Victoria, and ORAN. And I might be wrong here, but it does occur, it comes to a point that I think, Bob, you mentioned. having data sets that are, in a sense, siloed, they're data that's collected by an organisation for a specific purpose. Opening that data up to other organisations to use to potentially apply to other purposes, I understood was one of the key drivers behind ORAN. And in a sense, it gives you the ability to view things differently. And that's one of the critical things, I think, one of the best or the value adds that we're looking for.
Yep. Okay. Well, it's been terrific answers to my question. I did have one other answer on my slide, which was the fact that ORAN is, the data is staying with the custodians in this case, which I don't think is the case with CIV, and I think that's a very important factor as well, because they're the people who make the data retain its currency.
Well, we will have some data dumps.
Right.
But one of the other issues too, in terms of getting access to sort of real-time data, which is a big issue in the transport area, for example, one of the problems too we're sort of facing is, for research purposes, you also want to have consistent time slices of data to give you time series and so on, and that's often not facilitated by the data providers. So we're talking with some data providers there in terms of actually getting, you know, monthly, quarterly, annual sort of time slices and data dumps. And there is another federal funded project called the RDSI. It's just ramping up at the moment, which is going to be the National Research Data Repository. There's already one for survey-based data in Canberra, the Australian Data Archives, used to be called the Australian Social Research Data Archives. So, you know, we have had some of these around, but there is a systematic investment by the federal government occurring now in terms of starting to provide these research data repositories.
Excellent. I think that will do for my first question. And we've used up half of our panel time, I think. So I'm going to try and deal with the second question quickly, because I think it's easy to answer. The second question basically was, you know, we're only scratching the surface of the range of indicators that people are using to define well-being and livability. Is it important that we're only just touching on those? And I think the answer is almost certainly no. It's not important that we're only just touching on them, because these are demonstrators and there are going to be many more to follow. So unless anybody has a burning need to answer that, add further to that question, I'd just like to go to this one of exploring these linkages and what additional things can we do. I mean, we mentioned data in silos. Are we in a situation of having applications in silos, or can we take outputs from one as inputs to another, or can they be brought together? Can those outputs be brought together in some more effective ways, and so forth? So maybe we get a comment from each of the projects, first of all, on what they see as their potential linkages with others. Can I start with you, John?
Yeah, thanks. Well, there's an obvious linkage between the walkability study and our concern with access. But it does, to me, highlight the issue for us that access is a much more complex thing than physical access. We're very interested in exploring something about the relational sort of quality of how people access services. So, and some of the, even of the interpersonal sort of qualities or measures, but how you measure that, that's obviously much more difficult. But there's an obvious synergy there. So if we could link with the Walkability project and incorporate their tool to contribute to our maps around access, that would be a fantastic sort of link. I guess the links with the housing and employment studies are a bit more problematic. I should say I'm a qualitative researcher, so I came to this study very sort of naive. But we're using CEFA as our measure of social disadvantage, and it includes lots of measures of from census data around housing, income, and education, and so forth. So, but the portal and the tool might offer the opportunity to incorporate employment, so not to use CIFA, but to use more disentangled, disaggregated sort of measures of, and interrogate specific measures of social disadvantage. So housing, what's the issue of housing specifically, or employment? So I can see links there, and yeah, so those are sort of names.
Thank you. I like the point about disentanglement. Often people have these indices, and they've been created for a particular purpose, and people adopt them for other purposes. Who was next? It was employment, I think. Yes, Sophie or Jenny, if you want to jump in.
Well, I mean, I think I can hear various conversations in my head that we've been having about scope creep going on in this conversation, but if I put that aside for a moment, I can see, certainly within some sets of thinking about job accessibility or employment clusters, the question of walkability becomes interesting under certain scenarios. So if your notion of these economic agglomerations, that they happen when people serendipitously meet on the street, for example, then having a street network which facilitates this street activity, it may well be something that you would be interested in creating a crossover or an understanding within the cluster that you've identified, whether or not that exists. So that's one sort of area. And I think there's it seems to me that there will be, so long as the individual cluster can be kind of outputted in some sort of shapefile, you would then be able to apply the walkability model to that area. So that's something that's relatively easy to enable, I think.
Well, can I just turn it around? You're talking about how the other things might feed into what you're doing.
I was also...
Can you also maybe say something about how you think that the tools that you're developing could be applicable in some of these other areas?
Well, I think, for example, one of the things, I mean, our tool allows you to look at job accessibility on a variety of scales, and with the right, and you can put in different data sets. So with the right data, you would be able to look at things like disability, jobs that disabled people perhaps have, or people with whether or not special access needs people have access to jobs in particular regions, and how far they're having to go to get those jobs, which might add to the health study of whether or not engagement by people with these kinds of complex diseases in the community in an economic sense is enabled, would be another sort of relationship that we look at.
Some other things we've talked about regarding some of the other demonstrators, aside from the way that the walkability work would feed in and vice versa, the health work, have been related to integrating our clusters, our economic clusters, into the analysis of land availability and land administration. So you can imagine that proximity to an economic cluster would be yet another thing that is a determinant of land value or land suitability for development. And particularly different kinds of industry clusters may be suitable for one kind of development or another. So that's something we've discussed, and also just in terms of inside of the project Mohsen is leading, we've got kind of two areas inside of there. One is the work on land administration, and then kind of a corollary to that is a whole lot of econometric modeling and forecasting on housing affordability. And so we are expecting to use the outputs of sort of part one of that demonstrator, which looks at some indicators for land availability in a model of housing affordability. So we've already been able to integrate some of the work. Even though it's within a demonstrator, it's kind of distinct pieces.
Okay. I do need to keep moving, but a quick one.
Yeah, I just want to ask the employment group, the kind of outputs that are coming up, whether it's going to be very useful in terms of determining the activity centers, which would be an input for the outside probability analysis as well.
Yeah.
So the question is?
The question is, what kind of outputs would come up from your demonstrator in a way that would possibly be useful in determining the activity centers?
Well, if you assume that an activity centre is a centre of economic activity,
yeah,
then it will provide you with an indication, a spatial indication of where those clusters are, and the volume of them, the numbers of people coming into them. That can also be married with VicRoads data. I mean, once you have that location, you can then start looking at VicRoads data on, for example, patterns of road use is one of the things we talked about, to start to see, are you getting only patterns of road use, peaks? If you look at your transport peaks, if your transport peaks are only in the morning and the evening in the peak hour periods, then that activity centre is largely just an economic activity centre and not an activity centre per se. But perhaps you could use some of that as an indication of whether or not, if your peaks are more sort of spread over the day, then you're talking about people coming and going into the centre possibly for reasons of being there, which you might be able to suggest. You look at correct theoretical framework, you might be able to suggest that that's an indicator of it being an activity centre in the sense of people coming into that place to do other things than work. So I think there's some ways that we can use more of the data that's in the Aura portal to really start to look at these clusters once we've identified them.
And how are they getting there? Because that's the point of an activity centre.
Yes.
Like that it's an accessible place. So
and what
whether or not that's actually working.
Okay, we've got a lot of interest here, so we'll keep this going.
I was only going to comment that the land use mix itself, which is being used, should also reflect some of that.
Yes. Yeah.
And when you get big clue and you know the after hours results, and you know the after hours operations, you've got it all. You don't need VicRoads data.
I'll take that as a comment.
My name is Carsten Schütte, Department of Planning and Community Development. Actually the same bunch like Christine Kilmartin. I'm working in the urban development area of the department in central activities areas. I think it's important to acknowledge those transport-related issues, as you just mentioned, to eventually include also VicRoad data. I think in terms of the dimension of the work here so far, when we started thinking about something like that, that means Ian Butterworth and myself years ago, we were actually thinking it is not just the livability and health and well-being aspect. It is how those components are influencing urban development. And I think the demonstrators are actually reflecting that pretty good. If we are adding the fifth one in terms of the city of Melbourne, I think it has a good chance to lead a little bit the way, how you can have a more holistic, integrated approach to those things. Because they're normally shown quite, separate from each other. And I think that was the main thing we want to achieve. It's not just to find another livability mechanism, and in Germany, where I'm coming from, we are saying you are not trusting any statistics you have not manipulated yourself. I think it's important that those five demonstrators are working in a way that they can be influential to each other. And I think the housing affordability one with the employment one is an exceptional example where it can happen. But I think that's just one observation. You would have to revisit the way how you're collecting the data in the growth areas. You would have to make a second tool which is separating what's happening in the inbuilt areas from the outside areas, especially with the affordability aspect you were looking at.
Thank you. Austin. Austin.
Just a comment, I think, on the point that David made about, well, I think you could call the joy of the journey. You talked about the pleasure of walking and the pleasure of the trip. And it's interesting that I think your point was that a lot of the data is about origin destination, not about the journey itself. And when you consider that, I was thinking, I've recently started walking to work 1 day a week, and the level of change in frustration from a driving trip to even catching a train, I don't know if the data's there at the moment, but correlating the state of mind of the individual and the level of frustration that changes as you go from one mode to the other, I think would be very interesting. And all of a sudden, you get a different view about driving into work, that maybe it's not all it's cracked up to be, and the main frustration is that you want to be able to get in quicker and not be held up by anyone, which isn't going to happen. So maybe there's that trade-off about other modes being more enjoyable and enjoying the work, enjoying the trip itself.
One of the things that we want to do in collecting now is we're very conscious that once it's not about getting to the railway station or getting to there, then in fact actually you've got to understand what's along the journey. And it's not what's on the footpath, it's the view that might be there or the other things. It's about the space that sort of occupies around there. And we have absolutely none of that data at the moment that's coming into you.
Can I make a suggestion? They've got a cycling an app. You know, download an app, put it on your phone. You're interested in walking in your neighbourhood, there it is, contribute to it.
Yeah.
Tap into social media.
And that's what we're looking at, the social media side of things.
Absolutely.
Can I just come back to your original question on about integration of all of these? Some of the work that we're looking at in local government is the real disadvantage we've been able to integrate is the way that we've structured historically and architectured our data. Far too often we've worked in single documents or in blobs of data, and we cannot release the data because you've actually got my name associated with an address, for example, and therefore the whole of that data is now confidential. Where there's nothing confidential about my address.
Yep.
You can get it from any way you want. The only thing is when you associate me as an individual with that address. We've actually got to start getting much better data architectures, and one of the things, again, that I would actually like to see coming as an end user out of the research there is some really solid, relatively easy to use rather than sort of very complex sort of schemas that actually start getting this data architecture right. Because if we can start collecting it for you, it gives you much more opportunity to cross-link, but also to cross-link not only within your own private communities here. I recognise that a lot of it is all under confidentiality and CAT, but the real value, I believe, is when we can actually start releasing this into much more of the commons. And we'll only do that when the architectures are right.
Thank you, Dave. I actually wanted to come back to you after we finished the other things with a non-researcher's perspective, but you've already started to give us that. Could I go to Hannah or Marcus just to mention something? Everybody's already says how wonderful walkability is in terms of feeding into their project, so I'm not sure what you have to add.
I've always got something to add. What I think would be really useful is that whole notion of housing affordability. Austin, you spoke to that people move to the fringes because they feel it's affordable, it's they can buy their house, they can have their 3 children, 2 cars, etc. But what happens when peak oil or time spent in traffic, all of that is impacts on affordability, and it ends up being very unaffordable. So if we're talking about affordability of living or affordability of a house, they're 2 very different things, and I feel that people get that confused. And so if you can somehow, this is likely out of scope for this project, but just change people's way of thinking in terms of, hey, I actually do want to live in a walkable environment. for recreation, for transport, for just being in a nice space. That's really, really important. Mental health, physical activity, overweight, but these are huge problems that will likely cripple our society in 50 years' time. So we need to start thinking about how we design our environments to support that, particularly in growth areas. So if we can use these tools and change the way that people think about affordability and broaden it in scope, I think that will add real value. In terms of John's work, I think there's probably discussions that are going on already with people who may not have access to a car or have mobility impairments. So how we can actually think about that a bit more, and particularly when we are developing new GPs and healthcare services and clinics and provisions. Is it close to public transport? Is it in environments where they don't have to cross 6 lanes of traffic? So just thinking a lot more laterally rather than walkability, I think has a danger of getting branded as this walkability, but if we unpack it a bit more and what's behind it and what makes the environments better or worse to exist in, I think that's where the value lies.
Yep. And it's, I mean, you can sort of see that there's a potential with all of the demonstrators. I know in terms of affordability, I certainly use our app to work out where we're going to buy our house. But, you know, can you ride to work and you set the speed to it? For example, it's like 15 km. Can you walk to a station? You know, that makes a big difference. That sort of, you know, the vulnerability issue. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. To move, Melissa.
Well, in terms of integration, I think we've done this. I mean, the others perhaps talked about the integration and the potential of it. But I would like to sort of open up another aspect, building on Dave's comment on data interoperability. If we really want to, these demonstrators work with each other, we should make sure that we are able to reuse the outputs of data. We have currently enormous amount of unlocked data within this project, but we are spending a lot of time in integrating them to each other. So we should avoid the mistake, and we shouldn't should make sure that the outputs, for example, whatever format is or whatever sort of structure is interoperable across these 4 demonstrators. Otherwise, we'll end up doing the same data preparation.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll go to Nick, and then we'll do some up top questions, I think.
I'd like to echo a lot of what was said by one of our panellists earlier about Demonstrator 5. We've got not just himself, but Makaki's people CRV's people who've identified an obvious walkability data set as an input to the demonstrator. Your mention of employment data was interesting as well, because we've given some thought to that, but only just thought. Yeah, so there's that. Some of the discussion earlier of data sets not quite matching up in time or spatially, that's a real threat, and we'll definitely have to deal with.
Okay. I think we're getting close to time, aren't we? Do I have time to just get a response from non-researchers in the audience? We've had one from you, I've got your name, sorry. And David as well. What messages have the non-researchers out there got from this afternoon? You want to? Yeah.
Larry Fernando from Bureau of Statistics. I think the point about having common classifications is very critical. Point line in space, you've got to work out how you're going to record the points, what lines you need, and how you define the spaces. And using that, we have a spatial, but you also need to start thinking about how you're going to count your people, or the attributes of your people, or the things that you're going to be using as well. So I think it's fairly important to think about the classifications and the use downstream as well.
All right. Any other non-researcher who wants to comment, or have we only got the researchers left? I have. Well, finally, yeah.
I think as a non-researcher, one thing I would really love to see if we could come to a point where employment, if you are creating, for example, a Werribee employment precinct, what would be the outcome in terms of community outcomes, but also affordability for the area west of the Westgate Bridge? I mean, this is those questions, and they are relying on the underlying research this group is undertaking in the moment. David was rightly saying it's all about evidence. And I think the government of today has exactly this problem in making decisions about future investment in community infrastructure. So if people like local government associations, within local government associations, but also from an urban development point of view, as a state developer, have not this evidence in the back, we will get nowhere. And I think this also future projection based to give us some evidence about the now, but getting also some information and about consequences for the future would be an ideal outcome.
Right. Do I have to stop?
Well, you've got 1 or 2.
1 or 2 minutes? All right, I'll take a comment from Claire.
So Claire Bresner from the Department of Health. So the risks around chopping and changing data. One, just to follow up from Dr. Johns about the softer side of the statistics and how they're captured and used. I think health is one where, you go to your GP because you like your GP perhaps. You walk this area because you like walking this area, and I think capturing that softer, non-quantifiable data will be interesting, and I look forward to seeing how it's done.
That's a long-term challenge. That could keep researchers going for many years. One final question for either Bob or Chris. What's the take-home message for Oren this afternoon?
Well, I think one of them is that what we're seeing here is that particular types of research draw on a wide range of data, and there's some sets of commonalities across them. But the data per se is one thing. I mean, the census is a wonderful, the richest data set we've got in Australia, the most widely used. But the raw counts aren't terribly useful for most purposes. The data has got to be manipulated and transformed into data that's operational for specific purposes. And one of the things that we're trying to do with the Oren project is not just facilitate access to raw data, but also to then provide the capabilities through online mechanisms to translate that data into value-added data, if you like, or the data that can then be used for representing something that is more meaningful, used to integrate with other data to then calculate an index or whatever. I mean, a lot of data sets are just counts, and that's fine. But from a research point of view and to inform policy, the counts per se don't matter very much. It's what the data's translate into.
Let's jump in as well.
And just one other thing is we've talked about the synergies and integration across the demonstrators and how one area can inform another area. The other thing we're really interested in with the partnership with HANDS, funding the demonstrators and Oren funding the data, is that what are these demonstrators saying on the quality of the data, and what extra work do we need to do on data schemas, interoperability, on data sets that we haven't really considered that aren't in a good kind of consistent format like bars. So it's about learning also across, but also that kind of vertical opportunity to look across the data.
Great. Stephanie, do you want to
I guess one of the things that Anne has been very interested in is, and that's why we funded the demonstrators, is to show that by bringing data together you can actually do new and exciting things and things that have an impact and that interest more people. And I think that certainly happened. The other thing is I'm very happy to hear that lots of people talk about, you need to describe your data, you need to have provenance information, all that. So I feel justified in torturing Sarah with the metadata, because that's exactly what AND is about. That's why we want people to provide us rich descriptions of their data sets so that other people can actually go there and understand the context in which that data was collected and understand what they can use it for. So that's really good. Okay. And again, ANDS has quite a bit of material on our website about these sorts of things. So if you're interested in that, by all means have a look and talk to us if you have any questions.
Thank you. On the page here it says panel summary and close. Do you want me to? Well, I don't think I can summarise all of that discussion. I thought there were some fantastic points made, and what I would like to do is I would like to suggest that between Sarah and I perhaps we'll put up a summary of the discussion on the blog or something, rather than trying to do that here.
Absolutely.
Because there were too many nice points, which I had I been taking notes, I would have written down some of them, but I wasn't. So, with that promise to you, I'd like to draw things to a close and thank you all for coming. I think it's been a very interesting afternoon. I've learnt a lot and enjoyed the comments from a great many people. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I'd just like to thank all our presenters and the wonderful job everyone did at keeping to time. We had a planning meeting, we said, can it be done? We armed it up. We said it's too challenging, but we did it. So thank you.